As I began sewing my own wardrobe, I began wanting a dress form, primarily for the purposes of draping and visualizing the fit of my clothing. When I started researching on the internet, I instantly noticed a couple issues. 1. Dress forms are expensive, and anything halfway sturdy costs hundreds of dollars. Fully customized dress forms based on 3D scans go into the thousands. 2nd, I don't fit a standard size. My hips, bust, and waist measurement all span different dress sizes. Also, I'm shorter than the average person, standing at 5 foot 1 inch. This is when I came across Bootstrap Fashion. They sell dress form patterns customized to your personalized measurements at a fraction of the cost of traditional dress forms. I'll break down the total cost of materials later in this video. I took on this project in order to improve my sewing skills and get a customized dress form in the process. Bootstrap Fashion has several dress form patterns, but I decided to go with the full body dress form. I wanted a dress form with legs as I plan to sew some trousers. The more common pattern appears to be the dress form body, for which there is plenty of tutorials available on YouTube. Before diving into the project, I had to take a series of measurements, for which the site provided tooltips on how to accurately take them. I also noticed that my legs and arms aren't perfectly symmetrical. In such cases, I opted to use the larger measurement. There is an option to choose a seam allowance, which provides a 1 centimeter seam allowance. The pattern was delivered via email and accessible through the online portal. It comes with printing instructions, the sewing pattern pieces, and a zip file containing 5 different files of sewing instructions. Since I chose the letter paper size, I was able to print the pattern at home. Per the instructions, I printed without scaling and checked the grid square to ensure that it was exactly 10 centimeters. I separated the papers into 2 columns. Then I cut the left side of the second column and taped it to the first. I repeated this for all the rows. Then, I trimmed off the top dash lines of each row and taped it to the row above. Once all the pieces were taped together, I cut out the pattern pieces. For the main fabric, I chose to go with a woven cotton canvas. I found this fabric in my stash, but here are some similar fabrics I found online. The fabric needed to be durable, strong, and non-stretch for the body. In addition, I chose a neutral color without print to better showcase the clothing on the dress form. The fabric was 60 inches wide, and I used about 2.5 yards, though this amount will vary depending on your measurements. I pre-washed the fabric prior to cutting. For the interfacing, I bought a woven adhesive Pelon SF101. It was only 20 inches wide, and I used around 6 yards. I pre-washed it and hung it to air dry. The pattern suggests ironing the interfacing to the fabric prior to sewing. I decided against this. Instead, I cut out each piece from both the fabric and then the interfacing and ironed together afterwards. This is definitely more tedious, and I wouldn't recommend it. I also chose not to make the arms. At this time, I want to focus on completing the project and don't have a use case for arms. I laid out the pieces, pinning them in place, and then cutting them out. Make sure to read the pieces properly. The stabilizing pieces need to be cut on the fold. 2 of the leg pieces need to be cut 4 times, and the neck pieces only need to be cut once. Also, I found it easier to roughly cut around the pieces and then come back and trim it to the exact size. After ironing the interfacing, I notched and marked each piece. I would also suggest labeling the pattern piece number on the back of each piece to aid in distinguishing the different pieces when sewing together. Like the instructions suggested, I changed my stitch length to 2 millimeters. This provides needed strength to the seams. The provided pattern has a 1 centimeter seam allowance and claims to have built-in negative ease. I read online about people's dress forms running large after stuffing. I opted to sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I'll delve deeper into how this choice affected the resulting measurements later in the video. I started sewing the torso using pieces 1 to 12 and set the rest aside to avoid confusion. I started with the center back and pinned it to the side back, making sure to match up the notches. sew along the seam. After sewing, I made small clips and then ironed, pressing the seam allowances open. Attach the lower center front to the lower side front and the center cup to the side cup. Sew the cups to the lower front, clip into the curves to help pin in place. Optionally, at this stage, top stitch with a zigzag stitch along the cup lines. I chose a darker matching neutral thread. It's easy enough to see, however not too distracting. Sew the upper center front to the upper side front. Sew the upper front to the lower front. Sew the front to the back at the side seams. Here, I top stitched the bust and under bust seams. Then sewed the front sections together. Sew the front to the back at the shoulder seams. To sew the neckline to the neck piece, I made small clips into the neckline curve. Keep the clips less than the seam allowance. Pin and then sew together. Sew the center back together, making sure the notches and zigzags align. To sew the neck, clip into the neck piece. Pin into place. I was able to pin this without hand basting. However, hand basting would have made the seam easier to sew. Trim seam allowance. For the armhole seam, clip into the curves. Align the notches and pin. For this seam, I found it necessary to baste prior to sewing. Ideally, use contrasting thread to easily remove after sewing. To sew in the cardboard armholes, take the second armhole piece and pin it on top the previous armhole cover on the wrong side. Sew halfway around, then stop to insert the cardboard. Once inserted, finish sewing around. For the legs, I collected pieces 24 to 34. I started by sewing the darts on the lower back leg and bottom side back, and leave a long thread to tie a double knot at the dart tips. Iron the darts flat, pin and sew the bottom center to the bottom side back. The process for the legs is similar to the torso. I clipped into the seams every few inches and then ironed the seams open. Pin and sew the bottom center front to the bottom side front. Sew the upper outer front legs to the upper inner front legs. Sew the upper outer back legs to the upper inner back legs. Sew the lower front legs together. Sew the lower back legs together. Sew the bottom front part to the bottom back part. Sew the upper front legs to the upper back legs. Sew the lower front legs to the lower back legs. Sew the lower legs to the upper legs. Sew the legs to the bottom part. Sew the legs together. Turn one leg inside out and place it inside the other leg. Now you can sew along the crotch seam. At this point, I needed to buy the materials and pipes for the support system. At the hardware store, I found that a 1-inch metal nipple and flange would fit inside a 1 1/4 PVC pipe. I took the leg circles and marked a circle just larger than the 1-inch metal nipple. I sewed around this circle and then trimmed the seams. Then I turned this piece inside out and ironed flat. I double checked to ensure that it would easily slide in and out of the 1-inch metal nipple. I top stitched to further secure. I clipped the bottom of the legs and pinned the foot to the bottom circle. I didn't realize at first, but there is a front and a back, so make sure to match these properly as well as align the notches. After pinning, I hand basted this seam and then followed up with the sewing machine. Now for the internal bodice support system. I took pieces 35 to 37 and stitched the pipe sleeve at the pattern guidelines to fit over my PVC pipe. Then I attached the bottom front inner support to the pipe sleeve, sandwiching it in between the fabrics. Do the same for the bottom back inner support. I sewed some stage stitching in between to add stability. In hindsight, I should have first stitched around the seam line and then added the stay stitching, making sure not to pass into the seam line. To sew the support system in place, I took the front inner support and matched it to the front crotch seam. These seams should be open and sitting on top of each other. Pin one side, matching the notches and marks, and sew together, sewing these two seams together. Then flip the support and sew the other side, sewing the two seams together. Now pull the back support to the back crotch seam. Again, open the seams on the stabilizer and the legs and sew the open seams together. This time, to sew the second side, we have to flip the inner support piece to the other side. Once the piece is flipped, we can sew these seams together. In total, there's 4 places to stitch. Using pieces 13 to 15, I sewed the stabilizer for the bodice following a similar method. I carefully clipped the bodice seam at the neckline and proceeded to attach the stabilizer to both the bodice center front and the bodice center back. To join the bodice and legs, a zipper is used at the waistline. On the waist pattern piece, it provides a measurement for the zipper length. I used a separating sports zipper. First, I attached the zipper to the bodice utilizing a zipper foot to sew around. Then, I attached the zipper and marked the seam lines. Then, I removed the bottom and pinned it and sewed it to the legs, ensuring the marks match with the leg seams. For the neck, I used a car wash sponge. After removing the seam allowance from the neck circle, I traced it onto the sponge and cut it out. Then, I tucked it inside the top neck. To stuff the bodice, I used polyfill. Taking handfuls of polyfill, I fluffed it a few times before stuffing it inside. I took measurements as I went along and tried to keep the left and right sides symmetrical. Also, make sure to insert the PVC pipe into the pipe sleeve. Moving on to stuffing the legs. The pattern suggests adding foot cardboards, however either my pipe was too big or ankle too small that I found it impossible to fit a cardboard piece at the foot. I began by turning the leg inside out. Placing the PVC pipe at the bottom of the leg, I began stuffing around it, ensuring the pipe remained centered. I stuffed the legs, going a little at a time and slowly working up the leg. The pattern calls for making small strips in the pipe sleeves and gluing them to the cardboard. I haven't done this yet, as I still want to make adjustments in the stuffing. Finally, to assemble everything together, I added the cardboard cutouts to both the legs and the bodice. To put together, we need to slide the bodice pipe into the bottom pipe sleeve, while the leg pipes need to be inserted into the stuffed bodice. Initially, it may require some force to attach, but as impressions are made into the polyfill, subsequent reattachments should be smoother. How accurate is the dress form body to my body? Unfortunately, the dress form is far narrower than I am in the shoulders. This could be due to a couple reasons. One, I could have mismeasured my back width and gave the wrong measurement. Also, the arms might be used to bulk out the shoulders a bit and add some extra width. I created a spreadsheet of the measurements I provided Bootstrap and the measurements of the resulting dress form. As you can see, most fall within a 5% difference, some of which could be fixed by increasing or decreasing the stuffing. However, the most egregious is the bust height from center back neck point. I do not know why the pattern is incorrect on this measurement. Unfortunately, it's a drastic enough difference that I'm hesitant to use the dress form. How does this project compare to buying a dress form? I broke down the cost in a spreadsheet. I included non-sale prices and accounted for buying all of the materials. Then on the right side, I included how much I paid, accounting for the sales, coupons, and materials I already had. I was a bit disappointed to see that cost as much as it did. While still cheaper than standard size dress forms, the difference isn't as drastic as I originally expected. I wanted to love this dress form. However, a few issues have left me with mixed feelings about the outcome. If I were to make this again, I would likely choose the dress form over the full body mannequin. I'm not happy with the legs. The support system is cumbersome, the stuffing wants to fall out of the leg holes, and just the legs have clumps and lumps that I can't seem to eliminate. Also, the waist cardboard needed adjustment to match the shape of my waist. I added a 1/2 inch to the sides, we moved a 1/2 inch from the front and the back, and we traced the curvature. This was an easy enough change, however the stabilizers also needed adjustments. But I only realized this after they had been attached to the main form. As mentioned earlier, the back turned out to be too narrow. I wish the pattern had incorporated a shoulder-to-shoulder measurement instead of relying solely on the back width measurement. However, this is also partly my fault as I likely mismeasured and provided the wrong measurement. Also, the back to bust measurement is way too long. Unfortunately, the pattern doesn't seem to correctly account for this measurement. If I were to do this again, I would sew a test muslin of the upper body, making sure the shoulder width and the back neck to bust measurements are correct before sewing with the actual fabric. The provided zipper length was far too short. I wish I had given myself an extra 2 inches in order to eliminate the gap in the back zipper seam. I've provided links of the Bootstrap fashion dress form patterns if you'd like to check them out below in the description. I might revisit this project in a couple months, but for now, I'm going to take a step back, gather my thoughts, and see how useful it turns out to be.